In this documentary, I'm going to be talking about if the horror genre has changed over the past 100 years, and I'll try my best to explain what's happened. Also, I'll discuss if horror is going to run dry. To begin with, we'll look back at the start of horror movies. And what better place to start than the world's first horror film, The Devil's Castle, or The Manor of the Devil. As an avid horror viewer, watching it back now brings no real scares. It's more like a magic trick. But back in 1896 when it was released, nobody could understand how it was happening, and would be shocked at the almost witch-like way everything disappears. It is important to mention that since film was still a very new thing to this era, The Manor of the Devil wasn't made to scare people. It was merely made to impress and inspire the special effects. As time progresses, so does the film side of the horror genre. In around 1915 we see the start of horror films created to scare. They are the true start of the horror films. The Golem is arguably the first of its kind. It was a silent German film about how a golem falls in love with a woman who doesn't love him back. In outrage, the golem goes on a murderous killing spree. But the problem here is that all these are small and unknown films. The world doesn't really experience a blockbuster horror until the 1930s, where we get the Universal's first attempts at the Dracula and Mummy stories. Due to their success and popularity with the audience, Universal starts to launch more monster movies. And it's around this time that all the horror classics like Frankenstein, The Wolfman and The Hunchback are born. In fact, they did so well that within 10 years, Universal alone had released 2 sequels to both Dracula and Frankenstein. After this small backstory to horror, I want to introduce you to the premise behind the documentary, and some reasoning for it. Let's start with some key moments that have changed horror over the years. Right, well throughout the 20th century, we see some key moments that have changed horror as a whole, like some of these. William Friedkin's The Exorcist, released in 1973, sparked the demonic possession subgenre that is still popular today. Much of the film's success is due to the fact that it's simply unrelenting and unflinching in its brutality, and it dares you to keep your eyes open. Or not to pass out, as some audience members did back in the day. Horror movies that set out to shock and challenge audiences like this are commonplace today, but you can thank The Exorcist for making that happen. Now, everyone's heard of John Carpenter's Halloween, but it's hard to imagine this influential film existing without the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It almost single-handedly built the slasher movie template from the ground up. But, touching back to John Carpenter, since it would be hard to say that he hasn't influenced horror films, because some of his pieces of work are still fan favourites even to today. Just like his masterpiece called The Thing, which was released in 1982. Although it's often credited as being the original, there was a movie called The Thing from Another World that was made in 1951. But in my opinion, John Carpenter's version is far superior. Now, screenwriter Ben Reid touched on this very subject with me.
Honestly, The Thing is probably one of the scariest films I've ever seen because, like, it's part of that Cronenberg era of horror. Now, Cronenberg was really famous because he's kind of like the patron saint of gross shit. But he always used, like, real prosthetics. He made everything out of latex and would fill them with, like, jelly and goo that looked like real blood and stuff, which is why when you watch his movies, even though we've got amazing special effects now with blood and guts and everything, his seems so much more real. And, you know, Cronenberg's influence extends into The Thing. And The Thing is scary because at any point, even though you know the monster is basically just this, like, fucked up spaghetti bolognese creature of death, it turns into anything it touches and mimics it. So there are so many points in the movie where there is just scenes with everyone standing in the room and you know one of them's The Thing.
But you don't know who it is.
You don't know who it is, and like one guy's like, I'm not The Thing. And then, like, eventually when they rumble them, they just kind of look around and then their head will just split open and the fucking thing will come out, and it's just crazy. It's crazy scary.
The Thing used this better than any real film before it. It played with this monster concept that could hide in plain sight to simply terrify audiences in a way that hadn't been seen before. Now, I think it's about time we tackle one of the main questions. How have horror movies changed over the past 100 years? Right, so we'll run through this in order, jumping back to 1896 with The Manor of the Devil. As I've already said, it wasn't made to scare, it was only made to impress. This evolved into films like The Golem. Even if it was made to scare, this film only really gets its shocks from the horrifying monster itself and the concept behind the film. Advancing into the 1930s with even more advanced monster films, particularly Dracula. This film tends to give you the shivers before and after the film, with its abuse of the silence in the film. There's only one real scene with any music playing, and the rest is dead silent, So when the film has stopped rolling and you're left in the house late at night, that silence conditions you to think that your favourite vampire might still be around. Now, skipping ahead 20 years and we'll find ourselves in the 50s. Science has evolved and with it a new range of horrors that plague the back of our minds. This is why the era has a large amount of science and extraterrestrial related films, like The Creature from the Black Lagoon, where a science expedition happens across something strange. The War on the Worlds, which is about how Earth is invaded by Martians. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, once again another alien related horror. The Blob, about how an alien life form lands on Earth and consumes everything in its path. And The Fly, which is about how a scientist gets stuck in a teleporter device and his DNA gets mixed with that of a fly's. You also have other films like The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and Them. All of these films follow the same themes, and that's what horror had become. Films that played on deeper fears that Earth could soon be invaded from aliens, and how our own advancements could ruin us. This was the start of the sci-fi horror subgenre. Now, the 60s was a confusing time for horror. Universal had just released its next wave of monster movies with The Brides of Dracula, The Hell of Frankenstein, and The Curse of the Wolfman. Sci-fi horror was still actively around, with releases like Planet of the Vampires and 5 Million Ways to Earth. But the 60s was also the start of the modern-day zombie films. Of course, the concept could be dated back to the movies like White Zombie with Bela Lugosi in it in the 30s. But George Romeo's Night of the Living Dead really sparked the zombie/horror subgenre. And now, more importantly, around this time came the real psycho era of horrors. After the horrific Ed Gaines incident in the late 50s, it sparked these real-life monster films where traits of pure monsters get put into humans in the form of psychopaths. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho is probably the most famous of these films, and a real start to the subgenre. But from here, it really progresses in the late 70s. It's also around this time where slasher movies really take off, with Halloween being on the front lines of this new horror revolution when it was released in 1978. And this slasher horror trend continues right through to the 80s with the famous hits like Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and there are multitudes of sequels. But it doesn't stop here. The 90s was also a place filled with this style of horror. They played with the idea of someone being isolated alone, with some unknown killer around, watching their every move. Even if this idea might be simple, we've had hundreds of movies based off of it, some becoming cult classics like Scream. The 90s also gave us The Silence of the Lambs, another movie based off the actions of Ed Gaines. The mix between psychopathic actions and bloody scenes really shines during these 20 years. Finally, we've reached the 21st century, and we've had a whole new range and mixture of horrors. With video technology being what it is, it really creates a limitless expanse for the genre to explore. We've slowly been introduced to the demonic possession subgenre of horror, where it focuses on the supernatural and the unholy. We see curses cast, demons released, and poltergeists plaguing our homes. Movies like Insidious and Paranormal Activity are widely talked about and really give a good example of what audiences are into. But that's not all the noughties have to offer. There is a darker side in the form of torture films. Films that we put ourselves through for no real reason other than to horrify ourselves, to scar ourselves for life. These films take the form of stuff like Saw and The Human Centipede.
Sometimes I watch things and I think, why am I watching this? Like, for example, I have seen all the Human Centipede films, and I've become friends with some of the cast, and I even invited some of the cast members to speak to my students when I was teaching in a college, and we had a whole Human Centipede 2 event. I didn't screen the film because it's inappropriate for 16-year-olds, but we talked about it and we showed some clips from the trailer and behind the scenes things like that. So I've become a little bit of a apologist for the Human Centipede films, and I was even interviewed by the Telegraph last year for a piece they were doing on the Human Centipede 3 about why I thought the films had some artistic merit. So and they are gross. I mean, don't watch them. They're gross.
I've stayed away from them. I've heard a lot about them though.
Yeah, don't watch them is my first recommendation. But if you ever do, I think they've actually got a lot to offer.
As you can see, horror has evolved hugely over the years. Who can imagine someone from the 1930s watching the silent Dracula films and then watching the modern day versions of Dracula, like Dracula Untold? The difference is so huge, and then trying to get them to watch Saw. Torture films are more of a modern day concept, and showing them to someone from that era would be mentally scarring. Also, look how the themes of horror movies have evolved. They started out trying to amaze you, then they moved to bringing your favourite stories like Frankenstein to life. This transformed into aliens invading. We then came to how movies tried to make living in general harder by planting the idea that anyone or anyone around us could be a psychopath who might attack. This finally formed our fear of the supernatural and demons coming to attack from the underworld. And in reverse, could you imagine trying to watch black and white silent films with poorly made costumes and being scared as you might with the likes of The Conjuring? When you make comparisons like this, it's easy to see how films have changed and evolved over the years. What I want to tackle next is why are they changing, and are there any certain factors that indicate the horror industry is slowly going to run dry? So throughout this documentary, I've touched on the subject of Universal Pictures and some of their movies throughout the ages. I want to go into a bit more detail on their work, since it has a large part to play in the argument of why the genre is running dry. As mentioned before, Dracula was released in the early 1930s, and soon was followed by Universal classics like Frankenstein and the Wolfman. But what I haven't told you is just how many times these titles have been released over the years. Now, let's have a little count up. Universal alone has created 8 Dracula films and counting, 8 Frankenstein films, 3 Wolfman films with 3 other werewolf films, and then 11 mummy films. Some put this down to the genre running dry, and production companies having to reuse old film ideas just to keep it alive and the money flowing. Adrian briefly spoke to me about how he thinks these films follow a cycle, and he gives some possible reasons as to why, but I'll let him give you the details.
Well, I think most types of horror films come in cycles. And I think when you look back at the Universal films in the 1930s, they created the characters that we still sort of have now of Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Invisible Man, the Mummy, these kind of characters. So they kind of owned the characters and they made lots of films. They would team up. Dracula, would hang out with the Wolfman and all this kind of thing. But towards the end of their cycles, they start out as horror films, but towards the end they become parodies of themselves and they become comedies. And with the Universal films, they ended up being in Abbott and Costello comedy movies. And it took Hammer to do Dracula and Frankenstein again in the late 1950s to make those characters scary again. And then Hammer did the same thing. They went through a cycle of Dracula and Frankenstein movies and mummy films, until eventually they kind of turn into comedies and parodies as well. And so Universal they're still trying to use those properties. I mean, we had that film Van Helsing several years ago that was an attempt to revitalise the Universal monster franchise. And it didn't really work. Most people thought the film was terrible. But at least they tried, and they're now trying again. They're rebooting. We had Dracula Untold about a year ago. We're getting a new Mummy film with Tom Cruise, which is currently shooting. Universal Studios are planning to create a Marvel Universe type world where all of these classic monsters that they've got can interact. So there'll be a Dracula and a Mummy and a Frankenstein, and then they'll all start teaming up and having parties or fighting or whatever they're going to do. And so the monsters will go through exactly the same process again. They'll go from being scary to being funny. And that'll happen over the space of about 10 years, I think. And then they'll go quiet again for another 10 years, and then they'll start again.
So Adrian thinks it could be due to technological advancements making new heights possible, so Universal might be striving to keep creating better visual films. Ben Reid had another logical reason for what's happening.
One of the reasons that might be that they make so many Dracula films specifically is that Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is the novel where it was pretty much conceived, as far as I'm aware, maybe not the idea of the vampire, but certainly Dracula. That's kind of there's no copyright on it anymore. That's now public domain, so anyone can do Dracula. There's no one who owns Dracula, as far as I'm aware. I know that there was a thing about Dracula becoming public domain.
Okay, so since you don't have to pay for any copyright, it's just something that companies can just keep chucking out to get more money.
And I think potentially it could be the same for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, because obviously both of them are literary they're literary classics.
Everybody knows them.
Because everybody knows them. When a new movie is released, they're like, I know that story. Maybe I'll go and watch it. Like, generally the recipe for something good, unless you have a strong marketing team behind you, is you've got to make it enough of what people already know, and then you give it a little pinch of something else.
Yeah.
And that's how, you get them in because they're comfortable, because they're like, oh, this might be a bit like this, or I kind of know what to expect, but I don't know exactly what to expect, sort of thing. And I think that might be why, especially with these classic horror, like adaptations of classic horror novels, will always probably get made because they know people are going to see them.
So Ben credits the fact that the lack of copyrights make the film cheaper to make, and that since everyone knows the name Dracula, they'll be enticed to come watch the new film. Hey presto, lots of money. So if we can't trust large production companies like Universal to give us new and improved scares, then where will we find these films from? Thankfully, Ben and Adrian had more insight for me.
I think the inspiration is definitely amongst the smaller independent companies, but it's sort of like you have to sift through a lot of trash in order to find a piece of treasure. And that's why I think that it's quite good that people can make, like horror is something that you can make with limited resources and still make pretty scary. I think like it's an idea like that. It could come from anyone. You don't necessarily have to be a horror screenwriter or a horror expert or a connoisseur of horror movies. You could be someone who works at like Lloyd's TSB, and you could be on the train coming home from work, and you could just have this idea, this thought, that's like, wow, that's horrible, that's horrifying. I'm going to see what I can do with that. You write it up, you make it with a few friends if you're into making films, or you sell on the script to someone who might do it some justice, and it could be the start of the best ideas ever. Like the guy who came up with The Thing. It's a monster that takes on anything it touches. What a cool idea.
Yeah.
And that's what it takes.
I think you do find that a lot of the interesting ideas in horror do come from the independent filmmakers. If you look at Saw, for example, that was a very low-budget independent film that became a big hit with audiences and then became a huge franchise. Paranormal Activity was a fascinating production. It was one guy made the film in his house, basically, for about $15,000. He somehow managed to get it seen by Steven Spielberg, so it was picked up by DreamWorks, massive distribution, and now Paranormal Activity is a massive franchise. And the same with Insidious. The first film was very cheap, but hugely successful, and that's become a franchise as well now. So you get this a lot, that the interesting ideas, the slightly subversive ideas, come from the low-budget independent sector. And that's because horror films don't tend to cost a lot of money to make. You don't need to have a big cast in a horror film, because it's the concept that is the star of the film. Also, horror has a good network of fans who will watch, pretty much anything. So that means if you make a horror film, you'll get it distributed a lot more easily than if you make a romantic comedy. So if you're a low-budget filmmaker making a rom-com, it's going to be very difficult to get anyone to watch it. Make a horror film, you'll find an audience.
You might agree that the future of horror lays in the hands of the everyday Joe and their nightmares, or perhaps the scripts of the independent filmmakers. You might even decide that the future of horror should be given to the large productions and their increasing amounts of remakes. On the other side of that argument, what I do think is that horror isn't going to die off. It's never truly going to run dry. If you think back to me discussing how the 50s was the time of sci-fi horror, now look forward to 1989 and The Rise of Alien, which is arguably one of the most popular sci-fi horrors ever made, and it's almost 40 years ago that subgenre started. Next, look forward to The Exorcist, which was the start of the demonic possession subgenre, and yet 40 years on, that subgenre is still the height of horror. Even Dracula and all his remakes have stood the test of time, and is still continuing to capture our attention over 80 years later, no matter if it's down to new and original ideas or reinvigorated old classics. Horror will never truly die.